want to start with the country of Mexico, who is just about to have another presidential election. And certainly, if you live in the United States, you hear a lot about Mexico, but you don't hear a lot of substantive content from my point of view. Let's just say that. So we are really, really excited to have with us today Kurt Hackbarth, who's a writer and journalist with Jacobin Magazine, also the host of the Soberanía Mexican Politics podcast. Kurt, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Ron Eugene. A pleasure to be on today.
Well, really a pleasure to have you. I think some people probably have some sense that Mexico has an election that's upcoming here relatively soon. Maybe just to start, give us some basic context. Who's running? What are some of the major issues?
Sure. In beginning of June, Mexico is going to be having its next presidential election. There are three parties in the running. Morena, which is the party of the very popular Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is well ahead in the polls against a conservative coalition of three parties. The once hegemonic PRI, which has fallen on bad times very happily, the very right-wing PAN, a conservative Catholic party, and a smaller party called the PRD. And there's also a third-party candidate from a party called Movimiento Ciudadano, which is polling around 5%. The good news for the left is that Morena is doing very well in the polls and is en route to having Mexico's first woman president in Claudia Sheinbaum, who's ahead by 25 to 35 points in the polls against the conservative candidate, Xochitl Gálvez. The major issues in the campaign are basically the continuity of what's called the fourth transformation in Mexico, which has been López Obrador's package of energy reforms to bring more sovereignty into the energy field in Mexico and make it energy self-independent, together with a series of social programs such as pensions, scholarships, a doubling of the minimum wage, pro-union reforms, and such. So, in this case, with AMLO's popularity being high, being the continuity candidate is a positive thing. And Morena's looking good so far, despite, and I think we'll talk about this too, attempts from the international media to intervene as much as they can.
And, you recently wrote a piece about this, Kurt, for Jacobin called The Campaign to Smear AMLO as a Narco. And you break down the various ways that think tanks and mainstream corporate media have sought to slander not just AMLO, but also Morena, the party that he represents, that, his soon-to-be potential successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, if she wins the presidential election, would be leading the country after him for that same party. So can you talk a bit about why are the ruling class capitalists of North America working so hard to smear AMLO? What is the threat that he represents to their interests? And why is he, in fact, not in alliance with drug traffickers, as they seem to be trying to claim?
Yeah. One point is what I just mentioned, which with regards to energy reform. A big effort that AMLO has made over the course of his presidency is to take greater control, public control over Mexico's energy sector and strengthen Pemex, the national oil company, strengthen the Federal Electricity Commission. He recently purchased a series of power plants from the Spanish multinational Iberdrola to add to the public grid to strengthen Mexico's energy sovereignty. So, energy multinationals don't look at that kindly. That's one thing that the United States has never pardoned, which is a country having control over its own energy, or of its own natural resources, and that includes the nationalization of lithium. So interestingly, in January, the Baker Institute, which is a supposedly nonpartisan think tank at Rice University, which is really a nexus of energy interests, Texas being, the oil capital, but brings together energy interests from across the world, comes out with its Mexico Outlook report from 2024 and just throws in there that the Morena party and drug traffickers are going to be in alliance in this year's election. No proof, no evidence. They just throw it out there. Then the director of the Mexico Center at Baker, Tony Payan, gives an interview to the Texas Observer where he injects that into the U.S. media bloodstream. And then from there, it hops into Mexico and then Reforma newspaper and spreads out. In the United States, they see an alliance between Morena and drug traffickers in this year's election. So that's step one. Then a couple of weeks later, there's this coordinated, series of articles on the exact same day. You get ProPublica, you get Insight Crime, and you get Deutsche Welle coming out with an investigation that there was supposedly drug money involved in AMLO's first presidential campaign in 2006. The problem is that all of these investigations were based on an unreliable witness, Roberto Lopez Nájera, who was a former operator from the Beltran Leyva cartel. And basically all they were doing is rehashing a closed investigation from over a decade ago, very coincidentally right at the beginning of a next election here. So faced with all this blowback from Mexico saying basically what the hell, Stephen Engelberg, the editor of ProPublica, comes out and tries to say, no, there really was something there, because the original article said that basically prosecutors were underwhelmed, didn't find anything, and closed the case, right? Over a decade ago. Of course, they would have used this against AMLO in 2012 and 2018 had there really been anything there. So really the real revelation in that ProPublica report was that the DEA was trying to set up the AMLO campaign in 2011, trying to entrap operatives in the campaign with a $5 million sting operation. This at the time that the then security minister for the Calderon government, Genaro Garcia Luna, was in open cahoots with the Sinaloa cartel, something that strangely the DEA saw no evil and heard no evil about that. So, and then Engelberg reveals that the DEA actually asked them to change parts of the article, and actually they postponed the piece because the DEA requested it. As if that weren't enough, then the New York Times comes out with a piece a couple weeks later saying that, it's funny that they just go one after the other in a 1 month period, that there was supposedly drug money in AMLO's 2018 campaign. They gave no proof. They gave no evidence. It was all very vague. It was like a game of telephone, that you play with kids. Somebody said that somebody else said that some other person heard that. There were videos or something, but we don't know, right? And from there, this just becomes then a whole hashtag campaign. Narco Presidente, right? AMLO Narco, Claudia Narco. And, the troll armies and the bot farms get involved. It's funny that because of a series of spelling errors in the hashtags, my being an editor, I really like the fact that they were able to trace all of this because of spelling errors. They traced these bot farms to Spain, to Argentina, to Colombia. We were just using all of this and these bogus articles from the US to try to play up the idea of Narco AMLO, Narco Presidente, Narco Claudia, Narco Morena, Narco everything, right? To the tune of some 200 million views and reproductions, which AMLO kind of joked would even beat out the Super Bowl. And the good news of all this, to not extend too much, is there's a happy ending. AMLO's popularity rating went up 11 points over this period. And Claudia went up 5 points in the polls. So I really think this is kind of a part of a worldwide rebellion against Western corporate media across the board.
And I think it also touched on an important issue, too, in terms of AMLO's presidency that I was hoping you could sort of talk about and maybe help contextualize, is that he has been promoting a different approach to the issue of the war on drugs than what has been promoted for so many years by the U.S. and successive Mexican governments.
Yes, that's an important one. And that just kind of came out into the open when AMLO was interviewed this last week on 60 Minutes, right? And his new approach was laid out in 4 points, right? Which is basically, first of all, a $20 billion program to support social programs in Central American countries where, there's been migration. Mexico is itself already investing in these countries. A legalization of Mexicans who've been, law-abiding citizens who've been in the country for over 5 years, right? And some very important points here, end the sanctions on Venezuela and end the embargo on Cuba. Because as the president very clearly said in an interview, you can try all kinds of short-term approaches, but you are never going to address the immigration issue without addressing historical U.S. complicity in supporting intervention and coups and sanctions and embargoes and, a raft of other interventions throughout the history of Latin America, the famous open veins of Latin America. And it's really funny that U.S. social media just couldn't handle that, at least a segment of it. If you look at the 60 Minutes, they tweeted out AMLO's proposal, just a series of hysterical responses to a very moderate proposal. $20 billion is nothing for the United States compared to, a military budget of over 800 billion, plus, the billions more the United States is spending to devastate, countries in other parts of the world, right? A legalization program is, elemental justice, and the sanctions in the embargo. This is fundamental to address the root cause of all of this. And the response from so many people in the U.S. is, this is a blackmail. AMLO's blackmailing us, as if the fact that Mexico dared to make a counter proposal, right, to the U.S.'s proposal, which is basically the same as always, security wall. U.S. guns flow into Mexico basically unimpeded, right? All of the money that has been coming into Latin America from U.S. Aid over the years has gone into security cooperation and more policing and more, more military and more weapons and more this and fast and furious. It hasn't worked. It's just killed people. It's just killed hundreds of thousands of Mexicans and others, right? And I think, the cry coming from Mexico is, why do we keep having to put the bodies here? Why do we have to keep dying for this, right? And it's funny that the response was so hysterical to, a Mexican president doing what a Mexican president should be doing, which is making a proposal and advancing, his country's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, just last year, the U.S. was threatening to or U.S. members of Congress and the Senate were threatening to invade and bomb Mexico. So insane. But as we approach this election, I'm curious if you can explain to our audience what's on the line here. So you've kind of explained what the Morena party to some degree has done, what they stand for. What are they up against? I mean, you said that they're up in the polls. Who are their adversaries and what interests do they represent? And what are the chances that Morena will win or lose?
Things are looking good for Morena right now. But, no puedes cantar victoria, as they say in Spanish. You can't, sing victory beforehand, right? Because the opponents are very powerful, right? So you have multinational energy interests. You have basically the entirety of the Mexican press, which is against, Morena and against AMLO. And that includes public and private media, the public channels, the private channels, all of the newspapers, save one, right? You've got some very powerful interests with regards to pharmaceutical interests. You've got interests right now. AMLO's government is trying to ban genetically modified corn and glyphosate. So, you've got all of those big ag opposition there as well. So it's quite a range, right? And also, international networks like the Atlas network, right, which has different organizations active in Mexico, and just hosted an event here with a speaker from Spain's Partido Popular, right? So all of the far right interests, constellated around the Atlas network. And of course, the U.S. satellites, the organizations funded by USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, right? Because they fund opposition organizations here. So, it's quite a constellation. So I think you've got to give a lot of credit to the movement here, which has suffered through electoral frauds and stuff over these decades to have achieved power peacefully. And, in the face of, a daily onslaught, as I just talked about, AMLO Narco is just the latest iteration of, of an onslaught over years, has, maintained their popularity and, is looking good. What's at stake? What's at stake is, what the president refers to as the transformation of the country. Prior to 2018, there was no, national old age pension here. Lithium was still in private hands. The minimum wage was basically a slave wage. It's still too low, right? There's now a plan in the works with Claudia Sheinbaum to bring back a national rail system, right? All of this, unions were 90% company unions. I mean, this was the capture the elite capture of the Mexican, democratic system. So you see an opening there. You see a democratic opening, and you see, an economic opening. There's more to go. And that's what I think. I think voters really see this as this is a generational change. This is something that, is going to be a multi-term process. And Claudia Sheinbaum is now, has put her own emphasis and accent on this. She wants to now drop down the pension age for women to 60 from 65, right? She's a climate change engineer. She's got a whole series of climate change proposals. Mexico's in the midst of a water crisis, as are a lot of parts of the world. So it's exciting times. And I think part of the reason the opposition is so far behind is that they haven't articulated anything besides, let's go back to the way things were. And people are like, the way things were pretty bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was there in 2018, and it was just amazing to see the enthusiasm for people to turn the page on so many years of poor misrule. Well, Kurt, we really appreciate you. Real quick before we let you go, where can people find your byline and find you on social media?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for what you're doing with regards to Gaza. That's so important, and millions of us are really appreciative of that. I'm in Jacobin Magazine. I publish monthly on Mexico and Latin America. I'm also in the Mexican magazine Revista Sentido Común. On Twitter @Kurt Hackbarth, and we've also got our podcast Soberanía, the Mexican politics podcast with Jose Luis Granados Ceja, and English language coverage of what's going on in Mexico to break out of this, just awful U.S. Mainstream media bilge. Right? So we're happy to be there, and thanks again for having me.
Right on. No, we're happy to have you, Kurt Hackbarth. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you again soon, hopefully, as this keeps going on. Thanks for joining us on the Freedom Side.
Take care.